Hi guys. Um, okay, this video lecture is going to cover violence in literature, which we have seen a lot of in the stories we've read, and that's not necessarily by coincidence, but it is because there's so much violence in literature. Okay, what we're going to talk about in this video lecture is where did it come from, the history of it, what does it signify, those sorts of things. Something to think about is um, violence has always been present in literature in general. When you think about Western literature, European American literature, there's always violence there. However, sometimes it is meant to be serious and sometimes satirical. The story you're going to read for this week, it is satirical in that sense. There's also natural violence, all right? Earthquakes, monsters, those sorts of things. Dracula, Frankenstein, man-made violence, nuclear weapons, terrorism, that sort of thing. But it has a much, much, much longer history. There was a lot of early violent literature, like the Iliad and Beowulf. So this seems to be as crude and as pessimistic as it sounds. Violence is part of the human condition, and that's why it comes out in our art, in our literature. So, what we're going to focus on is violence in literature, specifically in American literature, and specifically during the 20th century and so far into the 21st century. The 20th century is characterized by an escalation of violence. Globally, historically, World War I, World War II, Vietnam, the Cold War, all of those things. But it becomes even more, the literature of the period becomes heavily, violence escalates in the literature of the period as well, is how I should put it. That being said, literature became substantially more violent after World War I, and then even more so after World War II. Hitler, Stalin, the Holocaust, there was the unimaginable death, okay? So 20th century literature is often defined by its violence, okay? Mostly through large-scale warfare and individual crimes. But why? Why are we clinging to this violence from events that have passed? After World War II, there was this great fear, this great anxiety, this great sense of dread over humanity's propensity for violence. I'm sorry, hold on. My dogs are freaking out. Another element that that influenced the escalation of violence in literature post-World War II was also the proliferation of nuclear weapons. Now, between the United States and the Soviet Union at the time, there were enough nuclear weapons to completely destroy all life on Earth. So a few men had the power to do this. With the first half of the 20th century characterized by these two global conflicts that killed lots and lots and lots of people, and the invention of incredibly devastating weaponry. Culturally, socially, humanity began to feel that the world was inescapable of long-term peace, or that's a world inescapable of long-term peace. There would be no long-term peace, okay? There's also the sensational appeal of violence. Violence very much sells books. And then violent fantasies. We could go a lot into this. It's less of an influence than the others, but if you're reading a book about your girlfriend cheating on you, you may fantasize about the violence you would do to the person she's cheating on you with. We do have these violent fantasies. you have these violent fantasies of, you know, pushing your boss in front of a truck. I don't know. So this is part of us, all right? Now, come on. All right, so a little more information about the escalation of violence in the 20th century. It became impossible of not confronting violent behavior in literature that was set in the modern world. We were living in a world of violence. It was impossible to not write about it. George Orwell in 1984, hugely influential when it comes to violence in literature. Kurt Vonnegut was another one. He had this very pessimistic view of the world, and he viewed the world as being swallowed up by sweeping violence. Generally speaking, he meant war, but it could have been anything, I guess. So there's this existential impotence in response to the two world wars. What can we do? Who are we now? What am I? What can possibly be done? I can't save those people. So basically, this depression over what has happened and this anxiety of it happening again and the uncertainty of what you can possibly do to mitigate any of this violence became very ingrained in the second half of the 20th century. And then technology, I mentioned this in the last slide, the human capacity for violence had reached unthinkable levels. Nuclear weapons, napalm, Agent Orange, biological weaponry, chemical weaponry. The capacity for violence had reached a point where it was 50 years prior, it would have been unthinkable. Reasons for violence in literature. We often see these types of stories where it can provide hope in overcoming or merely surviving violence. You think of, this is kind of not the best example, but you think of shows like Walking Dead, where incredibly violent, but there's still I haven't watched in a while, but there's that element of hope that was being clung to, that they would survive or they would overcome it. Okay. Violence in literature is generally not celebratory. It's usually condemning violence, or it's very critical of violence. Okay. That's another trend that we saw beginning after World War II, where you'd have these stories that were horribly violent, but they weren't celebrating the violence. It was a criticism of the violence, or trying to end the violence, or trying to overcome the violence. Okay, and then violence can be satirical or realistic. Using violence in a satirical way can be very powerful. By pointing out, the absurdity of the way human life is right now, or it can be realistic and used in a way that is helpful. Okay. Okay. So American violence. I have enough time. All right. So obviously we have our history, European settlement and genocide, frontier violence at the time, which at the time was considered pure and healthy. Civil War, World Wars, post-World War II, and postmodernism, and now the new age of terrorism. Okay, and this gives us an idea of how particular writers during those time periods used what was happening around them. So, during frontier violence, the Civil War, that era, Poe, Hawthorne, Melville, they were the greats of American Romanticism. Their stories often involved violence through nature, monsters, and even people. Okay. Now, during American modernism, so we're talking World War I and post-World War I. Okay. Hemingway, Steinbeck, and Faulkner were some of the greats of that time period. They condemned violence in their stories. Violence in their stories was meant to portray a moral wrong, but they also still used it as shock value. Okay, but it was used in a way that would eventually be condemned, if that makes sense. In American postmodernism, so we're talking about after World War I, we're talking about, or after World War II, I'm sorry, we're talking about the Korean War, Vietnam War, War on Terror, even, we could argue. You see a lot of hyper-violence in these types of stories, and violence as freedom. There's this general theme during this time period that those who engage in horrendous acts of violence are free. They are the freest people alive because they have shunned away all of the norms of our society. Now, nothing good generally happens to these people in these kinds of stories, but it's using violence hyper-violence and violence in a different way. It's using violence in a more philosophical way. We also see an explosion of satire, which condemns violence through showing absurd violence. And some of the authors known for this, Don DeLillo, Cormac McCarthy, Bret Easton Ellis, Chuck Palahniuk, and George Saunders. So we see this shift now of using violence to ask philosophical questions. Okay? That is it for this.